Investigators often have to conduct interviews related to traumatic events, and science has shown that trauma can rewire the brain in ways that make traditional interview methods less effective. WZ's trauma informed interviewing seminars train investigators on how to recognize the signs of trauma, how trauma response behaviors inhibit fact gathering, and most importantly, how to change their interview approach to achieve better outcomes for themselves and their subjects. Enjoy this free webinar on the importance of becoming trauma informed, and then click the link below to register for an upcoming session.
This morning, I've got the privilege of chatting with my good friend here, Detective Bryan Barlow. So let me just give a quick introduction to Bryan, and then we'll talk a little bit about what this next 45 minutes or an hour is going to be about. But what I want to make sure, this is an hour for all of you, right? This is not an hour of having to listen to just Bryan or I lecture, because we really want to hear your questions, your input, your thoughts. And if we can't get to your questions today, we'll make sure between Bryan and I, we can get some responses and send them out to everyone. So we know that trauma-informed interviewing may be something that's new to a lot of you, might be a new concept, maybe something that you want to learn about, or maybe something you've been doing for a while. So we welcome your questions and your comments. I know we've got folks from kind of a whole bunch of different verticals and job responsibilities on. So before I introduce Bryan and kind of kick off with some content, I'm going to throw a poll question up here just to get an idea for us as we kick off. And you guys will see this pop up on your screen in a second, of what types of job responsibilities you might have. And you might just select it's only single choice. Select what you think is the most common job responsibility that you have. So I've got a ton of responses coming in, Bryan. I'll show you here in a second. It's a secret poll to make sure that I audit the votes here before we publicize them. This is great. We got almost 300 people here responding, which is pretty neat, pretty exciting. All right, as they're coming in, got about 200 results. So if you took too long, I'll just make up your answer for you. But I'm going to share this with the group so we all have kind of an idea. Looks like we've got about half the group is doing a lot of theft and fraud investigations. And I know you might be doing multiple of these, but kind of your most common cases we've got on the call here: theft and fraud conversations, a lot of employee relations conversations, so discrimination, harassment, probably workplace violence. We got a good number of law enforcement folks on the call, some doing conflict resolution, crisis intervention, a handful of people, and I'm sure everybody is doing performance management to some capacity and some job interviewing and consulting. So I think that's good just to give us some insight. But now that we know a little bit about you, let me tell you a little bit about Bryan here. So Bryan, first of all, told me that if you want to book him for any modeling contracts, just contact him directly. You don't have to go through me on that one. Is that correct, Bryan? You've got a
Absolutely.
BryanBarlowModeling.com website. Bryan has been an awesome partner for WZ, a good friend, a great law enforcement professional. He's currently a detective at Chicago Police Department. He's also a certified forensic interviewer and instructor for Wickler, Zalowski and Associates. And as you see Bryan's title up here, he's a training coordinator and instructor for the Bureau of Detectives at Chicago PD. And what's really neat about that is Bryan has had the opportunity to write new curriculum, to train in-service officers or detectives. He works with new recruits at the academy and does a really good job of mentoring and kind of keeping track of everybody as they progress through their career. He's very passionate about making sure that people are well-versed in their job functions. And the other thing that impresses me about Bryan that I'm excited to share with you all today is he's got this passion for interviewing, and specifically trauma-informed interviewing. So Bryan has taught some classes on interviewing victims and witnesses, investigations of sexual assault. And I remember when Bryan first came to WZ about teaching trauma-informed classes, we asked him, well, what kind of research is there around this? Because we're really focused on evidence-based. Without hesitation, Bryan, I think you pulled out 2 or 3 textbooks from your backpack that you just decided to carry around with you and had them ready to go. So we are honored to have you here today to talk with us. Bryan's also hosting a trauma informed interviewing class in a few weeks. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And recently taught a few classes with WZ specifically for trauma informed interviewing. So last thing with Bryan, from an education perspective and experience perspective, kind of neat is outside of just law enforcement. Bryan has his BA from University of Oklahoma. I didn't want to get the college wrong because he's a bit of a college football fan with the Hokies, allegedly.
Hokies.
I know, got you.
Wow.
I knew that was going to happen.
Boomer Sooner.
Yep, I knew that's why I did that. But Bryan also has his MBA. He's got some business experience that we'll talk a little bit about. Currently pursuing his master's in legal studies because he's just crazy and wants to keep educating himself, and a proud veteran of the U.S. Army. So welcome, Bryan. I'm sure I missed a lot, but if you want to just kind of chat a little bit more about maybe your career background and how you got to the spot that you're in now.
Thanks a lot, Dave. Yeah, exactly. I actually out of college, I started off college, and then I left within a year because I didn't really have a lot of money to pay for college. So I did what everybody else does in that case. Hey, let's let the Army do it. So I joined the military, wound up finishing college, and I became a management consultant, and I got a job in Chicago. And so as that management consulting, I focused on things like employee relations, employee communications, specifically on issues of like workplace culture, which is, if you read the article that we just put on the blog, that's why I mentioned culture so much, is because, you know, the thought there was, if we're really focused on organizational cultures when it comes to building something good and something that works well and all that, but what do we do when things go wrong, when there's problems? And that's where, you know, the trauma-informed issue can really help out. And then, you know, I was wow, there's even a Notre Dame fan on here, Dave. Sorry, that's just distracting.
I saw that.
Yeah, I saw Oklahoma beat Notre Dame and Notre Dame one time. It's really cool. Anyway, so anyway, I was doing that, and I was a consultant when the .com bubble burst. And so at that point, I did what most people would do in a situation like that, and decided, hey, you know, it's time to go back to grad school. And that's when I started the MBA. And at the time, I was, you know, I was in the reserves, and I really, really liked it. And I really wanted to go back active duty Army, but my wife is an attorney. So that would mess up her career. So I thought, okay, what's military and local? And that's how I came up with the police department. And so I started doing that, and I became a detective with about 5 years on. It's really what I wanted to do when I got on the job. And I've been doing it ever since. I went into the training aspect, I want to say about 7 years ago now. And I just love it. It's an absolute passionate thing. And as you said, there's, as far as how did I get into this specifically, a few years ago, Illinois passed a law that basically stated that it revamped all the procedures that were used by detectives and police officers when it comes to investigating sexual assault allegations. Because law enforcement officers, I'm sorry to bust us out like this, but we did this badly. We did it terribly. And it wasn't because anybody was particularly bad police officer or anything. It's just because nobody ever trained us on it. Nobody told us about, you know, psychological trauma, how it impacts people, things like that. And so there was a big push to get that training in for police in Illinois, specifically around the issue of sexual assault. Well, oddly enough, around the time I start doing the research for this, because I'm the detective trainer, and at the time I was the only one, so that was going to be me. I was, you know, passed that law, and I knew right away that's going to have to be me. And so when I started going and doing all the research on it, at the same time, right around that time, I got diagnosed with post-traumatic stress myself, and it's job related from you know, at this point almost 30 years of policing and the military. And it was kind of interesting because they were talking about the process of trauma in the brain, and I was just fascinated because I was like, oh my gosh, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's why I do this, that's why I thought this, and it was eye-opening. And so while I put all this together in the context of sexual assault investigations, when we teach it and the way we apply it in Chicago specifically now is more about everything. I do it specifically for sexual assaults. We branched into doing it for homicide detectives because witnesses can be traumatized by seeing a homicide. The family members are traumatized by losing a loved one. And pretty much, is anybody in law enforcement knows, all you're doing is talking to people who've been traumatized one way or another, whether it's from being in a car wreck all the way up to witnessing a homicide or being sexually assaulted themselves. So it became a very big thing and a very applicable thing. And I also push it when, especially with recruits and detectives who will be sitting on crime scenes a lot, which is kind of what happened to me. But to watch out for it in themselves and in their coworkers, their friends, things like that too. Just because law enforcement it's always been a tough job, but it's kind of ridiculously tough today. And there's a lot of impact that has on people's psyche and how they take care of themselves. And so overall, and then of course, Dave, when we go into the whole non-confrontational interviews and interrogations thing, especially because, Wicklander was at the forefront of talking about like non-confrontational interviews and issues with false confessions. It's amazing how this is applicable not only to victims, not only to witnesses, not only for self-care, but even with suspects, because there's a lot of things, if we do these suspect interviews and have just a background in trauma informed and understand what trauma does to people, how they remember things, but also the proper techniques for asking questions, we can avoid a lot of the issues that seem to come up, especially when you look at post-conviction motions on false confessions, things like that. It's not that the investigator necessarily went out there trying to get one. They were probably doing what they were trained to do and what was the best practice at the time. But knowing now, with all the research coming out and all the evidence shows, the best practices 30 years ago aren't necessarily the best thing to get the most reliable, statement from someone. And if we ask questions in a trauma-informed manner, we can stop a few of those issues that come up that lead to those false statements. So that's a little bit long-winded, but that's kind of how I got where I'm at.
No, I think that's great, Brian. And it triggers a lot of follow-up questions that I'm sure people have, and I have. That last piece you mentioned is really important, is when you look at whether it's false confessions or false information, is the social science research on trauma-informed interviewing didn't really exist, or at least wasn't really well known 20 years ago. And so there's a lot of cases now where people are being either exonerated or they're re-investigating cases because 20 years ago there was an interview that was done and we made assumptions that somebody was guilty or somebody was lying or somebody was inconsistent with their emotions, which meant they must be responsible when in fact they're exposed to trauma. But what I want to put up one more last poll question, because you mentioned some, I think, a really interesting crossover from the law enforcement perspective to what happens in the business world. And even myself, when we first started talking about trauma-informed interviewing a few years ago, I was a bit ignorant to the fact, when I hear trauma, I think sexual assault, I witnessed a homicide, I witnessed a violent crime, somebody had a wartime incident or a violent incident. And so I'm going to put up one other poll question for everybody. This one, you can select multiple responses. Let me launch this. And the question that, Brian, that I'm asking everybody is, what exposure do their interviewees have? So what are the different types of things that people they talk to might experience? So I've got this launched right now. And so select as many of these as you might deal with, and I'll leave it up for a few seconds, but we've got responses like workplace violence. Obviously recently, it seems like every other day, there's another incident of workplace violence, discrimination, harassment, performance management, meaning if you have to talk to an employee about their performance, maybe write them up or coach them or counsel them or terminate, disgruntled customers, personal issues, dealing with shoplifting, civil unrest. So I've got just a few examples here. We've got about 200 or so responses. So I'm going to end this and share this with the group so we can look at it. All right, Brian. So as you can see this, and I'll leave this up for everybody here for a minute. When we talk about trauma informed, I know we've got a lot of people on the call that aren't going to be interviewing a homicide suspect or a witness to a violent crime, but they might be interviewing an employee who's experienced any one of these types of issues. So when people think of trauma itself, how can we widen the scope of what we define trauma as? How does it apply to an employee that works at a retail store?
Wow, it applies in a lot of different manners. And there's, and as somebody just said, many of these issues show up in one interview, and that's exactly what I was thinking too. I mean, if you think about it, as an employee in, say, a retail store, say you're on the Magnificent Mile in Chicago, which I don't know if anybody's been watching the news lately, has been hit pretty hard with crime, looting, things like that. But, you know, somebody who's, you know, what is the profile of our normal retail employee and or retail manager? Now, I'm thinking back to my own experience working retail in malls in Oklahoma growing up, things like that. But it tends to be younger people, maybe either in school or fresh out of school, not that far along in their careers, stuff like that. So at that point, nobody expects to go into, oh, I have a passion for selling this kind of product or this kind of service. Nobody expects that their store is going to get hit with, you know, 20 people running in at one time, grabbing everything they can, knocking over customers, and then running out. So, and that's not what they signed up for. So that can be traumatizing in and of itself. And then you've got somebody who's brand new in their career, possibly, who doesn't know that, oh my gosh, is this going to get me into trouble? So now they're looking at it, did I just fail in my career before I even started? So it could be multiple different issues there that can be traumatizing. And then the other part is simply not only specific incidents, but witnessing other incidents or listening to people retelling incidents. If you happen to be in a service industry where you're going to be listening to people, and like I said, we talked about this in context of self-care a lot, our HR professionals are hearing a lot of traumatic stories. So that in and of itself, that's secondary trauma, can be a thing too. And a lot of times, you know, you hear from all the workplace violence stories too. Everybody just went to work expecting a normal day. Nobody expects, unless you're a law enforcement officer on patrol, nobody expects something weird to just happen right, you know, out of the blue. So everybody expects that they're going to be safe. Everybody expects that they're going to see people that they know and to some extent, I guess, trust. I mean, I know there's workplace harassment issues, things like that. Nobody gets along with everybody, but by the same token, we all have an expectation of like how our day is going to go when we show up to work. And when something, especially something traumatic or very unexpected or completely out of the ordinary happens, it can throw off our balance there. And so as far as, you know, in the workplace, it could be any number of these things. It can be, you know, family issues. Like if you've got a performance related issue and you're going to counsel somebody, well, you may not know that their spouse just got diagnosed with cancer or their spouse just lost their job, which may completely, you know, explain the performance issue. But then now you've got the issue we're moving into is coaching and how do we support that employee through this tough time. And so this is where trauma informed is. We might be looking at one thing and it's something completely different.
Yeah.
So, I mean, some of these are very obvious, you know, workplace shootings, but like the performance related stuff, you never know.
Yeah, I think that's what's really the important takeaway is I would imagine the professionals on the call would understand if my employee had 20 people come in and shoplift the store and they were violent and they injured somebody or they were, you know, cursing in an employee's face, that's going to be traumatic. But what we're also seeing, you know, Helen talks about disgruntled customers, especially post-pandemic. I mean, in the last couple of years, a lot of retail employees were simply dealing with customers who didn't want to wear a mask, and they're yelling at a cashier about enforcing a mask policy. Todd brings up a good point too. Even somebody you're talking to that may have had either a previous conviction, a previous interview, maybe prior interaction with law enforcement could be traumatic, right, in this follow-up conversation. But you had shared something with me earlier, Brian, that I thought was also applicable, is if we kind of have this obvious thought, if there's a violent situation, trauma is probably applying. But what if I'm just an HR professional or just a manager of any sort, and I'm talking to my employee about performance, and I put them on a performance improvement plan. So, you know, they got 3 months to do X, Y, and Z to kind of maintain their job and hopefully upskill them. Can that be traumatic, or what kind of impact can that have on somebody that has nothing to do with a crime or an incident? It's simply holding somebody accountable.
It can be totally traumatic. Just because trauma usually involves some kind of a threat, and the threat can be explicit, you know, gun to the head, things like that. but can also be implicit. One of the most interesting podcasts I heard, the subject wasn't necessarily trauma, but it was a guy, he was talking about his life and everything, but he happened to go through one of those instances where he was a corporate executive, and then he thought everything was going just fine. And then one day, all of a sudden, they're like, okay, well, we're taking away all the people that report to you. Your job duties have been cut in half. We've got a performance improvement plan for you. And most people, if they think their job is going okay, never expect that. And in his case, it got compounded because he was the sole support of a family of 7. So he had a spouse and they've got 5 kids. And so since he's the one that's the breadwinner, all of a sudden this goes from being possibly, it's not even an ego thing for him anymore. He's more concerned about how am I going to put food on the table for my children. So that's something that comes up, even if you're not at that point yet. I mean, everybody, you all know somebody, and some of us do it ourselves, you know, the catastrophizing. Oh my gosh, this is, what if this happens? Oh my God. And then you're already well down that road before you even know what's going on. Anyway, with this guy, and I really enjoyed it just because he described a lot of my experience, you know, and what, you know, mine was job related, you know, to basically crime scenes. You know, 100 crime scenes was okay. 101, too many. Why? I don't know. It just was. And so, but in his case, he talked about what that did as far as treatment. He wound up going to a partial hospitalization program. He had to go in there. When we do the full trainings, we talk about signs and symptoms of trauma, and I talk about the ones I had. Mine were bad. His was crazy. And it was absolutely amazing because it wasn't linked to any particular incident. It's not like, you know, you could point to this, that, or the other. It was just kind of the overall situation that caused this massive amount of post-traumatic stress in his case. And unfortunately for him, it didn't really help him out as far as his job because he immediately had to go on medical leave. So, you know, but one way or the other, yeah, that can be an issue. And the other thing is that trauma, definitely, if it was a real supportive, let's coach people environment, he wasn't able to see that.
Right.
So the trauma can get in the way of actively trying to help somebody out too. So.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned that, I think about even just being at work for the day, or if I'm hosting a class, and so I've got whatever, 30, 40 people in front of me, but something's going on in my personal life. And so it may not be essentially traumatic, but something's going on. And so I'm so focused on what's going to happen during break, a phone call I have to make, or what I'm doing that night because of an issue, that I don't even feel like I hear what I'm saying to people in the room, or they ask me a question and maybe I wasn't as on point as I normally am. But if I think about, that's just teaching. If I was being interviewed one of those days, if I was being investigated, I can imagine that my details would be off, my emotions would be off. I'd probably seem a little distracted, and that could be easily misread. So I think that's a good point. And I'll ask you about that in a second, but just a couple other comments we had. Donnie, really good point. Employees victimized by social engineering scam, right? We've got an employee who answers the phone and all of a sudden activates, 10 gift cards for $500 each from some fraud suspect over the phone. And they feel so guilty from that could be traumatic. Employee misconduct, something on their personal life, all good. I know, Robert, you asked earlier if this is going to be covered in the 3rd edition of our textbook, and yes. And in the meantime, there's a couple articles that are free that are open on WZ's website that Bryan put together over the last couple of years that also goes into some of this concept. And we'll provide you some other resources towards the end of the call, but yeah, that definitely will be something in the textbook. But what I want to ask you, Bryan, from going back to that experience I just talked about, is it's important that we take care of the interviewee, right? That we are aware of what they're going through, but it's also in the private sector, right? Our job does end at some point, right? We have to be humane and develop rapport and respectful. And maybe we have employee assistance programs and things that we can help people with. But speaking specifically to interviewing, why does it even matter from ignoring the humane, obvious piece of this, but why does it matter to be trauma informed as an interviewer?
Well, I mean, I know we want to skip over the humane part, but it's first and foremost, it's just the right thing to do.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, just basically that's it. But as far as trauma goes, understanding, and you'll notice, in our trainings, we focus a lot on what causes trauma, what's the brain process. To be quite honest, understanding that, in my opinion, is a lot more important necessarily than even, focusing on the questions and all that kind of good stuff. It's more about understanding. The understanding is what's going to inform the right questions. But, it gives context to behavior. You mentioned the whole, if I'm so distracted, I may think of my brain may be going off here, and I may look like I'm not really paying attention. I may forget to tell you something that's vitally important. And it's kind of interesting because when I have basic recruits, one of the first things I ask is, well, how do you know if somebody's lying to you? Mm-hmm. And, I get all the answers, most of the typical neurolinguistic answers. Oh, they look up and to the right and all that kind of good stuff that we know is all, not really good information anymore. And I go over with them and I said, well, and I correct the fact that neurolinguistics is, you're only about as good as a coin toss, but everybody does have a tell, but you got to figure out what that is. And all that. And I said, well, what about their story? And they say, well, the story's all over the place. Maybe they can't tell it in a chronological order. Oh, maybe they remember that important detail after you point something out. And I said, yeah, oddly enough, when I'm got a suspect in an interview room and he's telling me, oh yeah, this and then this, and it's just all over the place, I know he's just got so many lies going on in his head, he can't keep it straight and he's going to lose it. But the problem is every single one of those symptoms of every one of those indicators of, falsehoods, indicators of lying, are also perfect symptoms of trauma. It's the stuff you can expect. And this is why it's kind of interesting. One of the best researchers in this is, I can't believe I just blanked on her. Professor at Michigan State.
Come back to it.
Yeah, we'll come back to it. But she's a professor at Michigan State, and she's absolutely amazing. But one of the things she did, she's one of the pioneers as far as like exploring trauma interviewing with victims of sexual assault. And she started her career as an intern. Yes, Rebecca Campbell, that's it. I don't know, I just blanked for a minute. She started her career as a new PhD. She was working with the Chicago Police Department. And she says this in some of her videos, where she's a 27-year-old PhD, so of course she knows everything. And I don't know if anybody knows any old detectives, which of course does not include me because I'm not old. But old detectives, they tend to know everything too. Well, the old detectives were really convinced that all these victims were lying. And she said, well, why are you so convinced? Well, she first said, no, they're not. And then they just basically agreed to disagree. And then one time she went back, she said, well, why do you think they're all lying? And they started explaining all these behaviors, and then every single one of those behaviors, she's like, yeah, that's a symptom of trauma. That's a symptom of trauma. That's a symptom of trauma. And that's the problem that we have, is we never trained law enforcement on any of that. And that's why we did these investigations badly. And so all these indicators of what we would consider to be deception are also indicators of trauma. So if we understand what's going on in the brain, we can get better interviews. We can help with the memory recall issues because we understand why the memory is messed up. We can also be more empathetic just in general to whatever a person might be going through. So there are some things, I talk about how, disclosure is a process. It's not an event, which basically means if we think we're going to go in, sit down and get everything in one interview, probably not. And we have to be okay with that. Mm-hmm. And that's where, the understanding comes in. This may be several interviews and maybe remembering something later, things like that. So it's more about trauma informed is definitely going to help us out as far as getting a better interview. Getting a great interview from somebody who's traumatized can be very difficult. I've got an example I show in the class. Gives great information, gets the order completely wrong. How do we know that? Why? Things like that.
So I think that's a good point. If you're interviewing somebody, because we teach the cognitive interview is one of the methods that we will host in our class. And we know in the cognitive interview, it's often very linear, right? Tell me from this point to this point as much as you can remember, or from reverse order. And if you're talking to somebody who's been exposed to trauma, they might get the order wrong. Their behavior might be inconsistent, right? You could have a sexual assault victim potentially laughing when they tell their story because that's how they cope. And so there's research out there that suggests if I'm interviewing someone and I, for whatever reason, suspect that they're lying to me and I assume that they're guilty, which is not the right way to do it. But when that happens, is the investigator often changes their own behavior, is we become more accusatory, more closed-ended questions. And often the interviewee can actually pick up on that. They can identify at this point in the interview is when I felt like I became a suspect. And so the reason I say that is my question to you is it possible that the interview itself can be traumatizing, right? Can that re-trigger trauma? Because now I thought I went in just to tell my story. Now I feel like I'm being accused. I'm in a small room, with two other people or whatever it might be. Can that transition of an accusation be traumatizing?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's interesting because somebody mentioned in the chat that law enforcement gets so desensitized that it creates barriers with people experiencing what an officer would consider minor trauma. And thank you, Sarah McCartney, for that one, because yeah, that's an excellent point. And going back to what we've talked about earlier, if I'm pulling somebody over as a police officer, their experience with me is driven by the last time they were pulled over. Their reaction to me is based on their perception of law enforcement and what they've seen in the news and everything like that. By the same token, same thing with law enforcement. Our perception of the public is based off of our experience and what we've had to deal with. And so a lot of times that can be in conflict. And so there needs to be opening up on both sides. But like you said, when you're in context of an interview, you will see the tables turned multiple times. And because I hate to say this, but it's not an unusual occurrence for law enforcement to realize I've screwed something up badly with this. And I did. And I had one young lady that was reporting a sexual assault to me, and it was a particularly horrific one. But she was reporting it to me with all the, not understand. And keep in mind, this is almost 20 years ago. So there was absolutely no training on any of this. And she was explaining it to me with all the passion, anger, fear, sadness, grief, whatever, just as if she was reading a how-to manual to operate a microwave. I mean, she was flat, nothing. Like she was just reading off of a paper and telling me the story. And so she must have seen something in my eye. And she even mentioned it. She's like, "You look like you don't really believe me." And I'm like, "Well, you're telling me this horrific story. It doesn't seem to bother you all that much. And in fact, it seems, kind of rehearsed." And she says, "Well, what do you do if you don't believe me?" And at this point, I have a very helpful sergeant with me who's like, "Oh, we can charge you with filing a false police report. It's a class 4 felony."
Yeah.
And so she says, "Well, I don't think I need a report." She turns around and leaves. And at the time, I was,
right.
Good job, Brian. You saved the detective some work, good investigations, things like that. When you have old time detectives go through this training for the first time, there usually is a point, and it happened to me, where your eyes get really big and you're like, what did I do?
Yeah.
And like I said, this just goes back to, we did this badly, not because anybody was trying to do it badly, but nobody was ever informed of how this works. And so it was problematic.
I think though, you sharing that is powerful, right? We talked, Jim Trainum comes to mind. He's a homicide detective, a former retired detective from DC. He was another speaker at Elite Training Day, where I know you spoke for us last year. But he had obtained a false confession, recognized it, wrote a book about it, and now goes around and educates people on how that can happen. And so I think for everybody that's listening, it's being self-aware enough to realize sometimes we have to reflect back and think, maybe I could have done that better. I wasn't educated at the time. A lot of really good questions coming in. So keep those. I'm going to try to stay on top of these, but there's one I want to go back to from Bradley. And I get asked this a lot, and I don't really know the exact answer. I know there's some research that's kind of conflicting and still going on this, but the question is about how long after a traumatic incident maybe is the right time to do an interview, or does memory get better or worse? And I know, you've got some experience, especially in the law enforcement world. There's an officer involved shooting. How long until we should interview somebody? If somebody's assaulted, how long? What does that look like from a time passage?
It depends on what you look at. And like you said, here's the reason that there's going to be no good answer to that, is because everybody's different.
Yeah.
The interview that I did, that I show in class, that I think is really great, is a guy that tells me fantastic information. his order and the way he remembered it is completely out of whack. And I talked to him 6 months later. So just, I use no best practices in Illinois when they passed and thanks for bringing it up. I believe it was Sarah, was it? Somebody was mentioning that they passed a law in Washington that cost, Carrie. They passed the law in Washington for basically the same thing, trauma-informed training. And, dang it, lost my train of thought there.
Time passage.
Oh, yes. So when Illinois passed its law, they have what they call legislative findings, which is where they basically, when they start off the law, they start off with, well, why are we passing this? And in this case, they said they passed this sexual assault law because, it's a crime that disproportionately affects women, children, the LGBTQ community. It is impactful not only physically, emotionally, but psychologically, economically, spiritually. I mean, it's so impactful. And then one of the things they put in there is the best practice shows that, allowing somebody to have 2 full sleep cycles prior to an in-depth interview is the best practice. And that's really, a good thing. And you mentioned, police officers involved in the shooting. Aside from what the media sometimes portrays, I mean, the reason that we get that in Chicago, it's 24 hours. I think the federal government, it's 72. But it's for the exact same reasons. They're both to mitigate the memory effects of trauma. Because if somebody's in a massively traumatic event and then all of a sudden you're like, great, tell me everything that happened, they haven't even had time to process it themselves, much less be able to give you a retelling. And so that's kind of it. And so a lot of times, and like one of the things I train now is, some of our better detectives, because we need evidence, we've got to go in and figure out where did this happen, what happened, what am I looking for? So I don't want to start looking for video 3 weeks later when it's all overwritten. I need that. But in that, once I get the basics, I can do hey, you want to make an appointment to come in a few days and actually talk this through? And at that point, that's probably a better way of doing it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I've heard you talk about you and one of your partners before, even if it's a victim interview or a witness, is almost even asking them, like just kind of showing some empathy and then asking them if they're ready to talk, or checking back in to show some empathy for the situation.
Yeah. And that's with and that's it. That's where my old partner used to do that. He would walk in as a detective and say hey, I'm Ron. Can I here's my card. I'm going to be doing the investigation. Can I call you in a couple of days? Let me know if you're ready. And if you're not, we can take it from there. Reagan points out they need DNA evidence. What I'm talking about is, of course, we got to do the stuff right away. Most of the time, at least in Chicago, the vast majority of say our sexual assault survivors are going to report to a hospital. And that's how we initially get the call. So usually the kit is there or as part of the beginning of the investigation. What I'm talking about specifically is what were you doing before? What were you doing after? Where was going on here? What were the details? Things like that we can hold off on. We need to get the stuff as soon as possible for DNA. If we do talk to them, otherwise, if it's been in Illinois, if it's been at least 7 days or less, 7 days or less, we suggest they go to the hospital. They can still get DNA after that, but that's kind of for public health purposes, that's kind of where they're looking at it. So we still do try to get that. But before I sit down and try to take you through everything, if I get my basic evidence and basic idea of what's happened out of the way, we can take our time with this investigation. In a lot of cases, you have to. You have to take your time.
Yeah, and I think we're talking about so many different types of cases here, right? You got everything from a rape case potentially versus maybe discrimination in the workplace or a shoplifter incident. And so obviously timing and urgency may be different based off of imminent threat for other people and safety. So that would make sense. But Sean asked a question here, and then Christine actually talked through it as well. Kind of an example that she had is, let's say we may have an interview where we don't realize trauma applies. Right? And it may be a simple interviewing somebody for, Christine talks about return fraud, cash theft, essentially. Somebody did something fraudulent on the register. from my perspective, interviewer, it all seems like a pretty basic case, but I'm unaware that that person maybe years ago was interviewed and it was a very uncomfortable situation, or they were a victim of spousal abuse, and I'm a male interviewer and it's a female subject, and I, for some reason, trigger and remind her of that situation. So are there anything, I know we talked about not relying on behavior, obviously, for truth or deception, but are there ways that I can identify that maybe something's kind of being triggered to some type of traumatic activity that I didn't realize they were exposed to?
Right. A lot of, once again, once we talk, in the trainings, we go over the signs and symptoms. If we're talking to somebody like, let's say, that witnessed a crime, or, something like that, that was a particularly horrific crime. Well, we know that when we see these behaviors or these symptoms, that, well, that's probably trauma. Well, what if they show up when we're trying to talk to somebody and find out, like you said, was this an employee theft, or was this, the person, had a bad day and didn't realize they did a transaction wrong, based off of that. Well, one of the other things we do is we talk about ways of approaching people and how to conduct these interviews overall. And there are certain ways of just a general approach of empowerment, things like that. Just the way you approach people in general takes into account things like trauma. Now, is there ever a way to get a perfect interview? After doing this for a while, I would say no. We could just try to do the best that we can. And so a lot of these techniques will then help us out and try to mitigate what some issues they may have if they're coming to talk to somebody. I mean, I remember my time from corporate America. If the loss prevention, manager wanted to talk to me, that wasn't good. And it didn't matter if he just wanted to say hi. You put up that barrier to start with. Oh my God, I must have done something, or there must have been something happening. What it isn't, instead of just, but then I also remember my loss prevention manager, when he came to ask me about an issue, it was actually with another employee that I happened to be standing there. I didn't even realize the guy was doing something wrong, but he came forward. It was like, why didn't you report this? I'm like, I have no idea what you're even talking about. and getting through that. So at that point, you're like, okay. And it's like you said, people, like with cops, they're not reacting to me. They're reacting to everything they've seen on the news and every previous experience they've ever had.
Right.
So,
and you might be unaware of that as the interview, right? Until the conversation takes place. One of the other things, there was a couple comments about this. We go back to this kind of behavior standpoint, but these presumptions that people make on guilt or innocence. And we know that the research shows that our ability to detect deception based on physical behavior is basically a coin flip, right? About 54%. So that's not good already. Add trauma to it, it's even worse. And I think one of the other interesting research studies that's out there is people that have been through training on how to identify truth versus deception based on physical behavior were just as inaccurate, if not worse, but they were more confident in their choice, right? So they go through training, and now because I scratch my beard and I sneeze twice, I feel like this person must be guilty, and I'm more confirming that they're guilty. And so the other thing with behavior, I think, that comes up with trauma that I've learned from you is memory. Right now, you've talked about the order of events might be off, but in an interview, when somebody says, well, I don't remember what he looked like, or I don't remember how long it was, I don't remember what time it was, I don't remember if he had glasses on or not. And these seem like, if you're the interviewer and somebody had a gun to your face at the register threatening to take all your money, that you'd remember what they look like, but it's very possible they don't remember any of that. So why is that? How does memory and trauma intertwine with each other? What's the impact there?
Okay, sorry, I was told that there's some background noise. I'm kind of a victim of the building I'm in, so I apologize. Hopefully this will help a little bit. Memory and how does it affect it? Well, one thing, and this is where the research, as far as like brain research goes, and that really helps out, is understanding that trauma does affect the brain. It affects the brain processes. It affects the brain processes that do things like control emotions, that form memory, things like that. And so somebody may say, I can't remember that. But as I mentioned earlier, I focus a lot on, well, why is that? And once you understand the why is that, then you can understand how to possibly access that memory. And as I mentioned earlier, there is no 100% foolproof. We can crack somebody's, traumatic memory and get all the information. It's not the way it's going to work. But we can maximize our chances of getting good information and minimize our chances of re-traumatization if we ask questions in a certain way. There are certain brain-based cues that trigger memory. And when somebody's memory is affected by trauma, it's actually not, how do I put it? It's not that it's destroying their memory. Their memory is actually pretty accurate. The problem is the ability to recall. It's the ability to access memory that's problematic. And so by making an approach in a certain way or asking certain kinds of questions, we can maximize the chances of getting to that. Are we going to be able to get everything? Absolutely not. But that being said, you want to get as much as you possibly can.
One of the ways I've heard that from some of the trauma interviewing stuff I've set in with you is a simple difference between, let's say there was an incident yesterday, or a week ago or whatever. Somebody had a customer come in and become irate and whatever happened, it was traumatic. There's a difference between me asking, tell me everything that happened from the beginning to the end, versus me asking, tell me about the experience. What's the difference between those two questions? How does that help in a trauma aspect?
Well, basically, when we talk about the brain function during traumatic events, we have part of our brain that's our emotional reactions, and we've got part of our brain that's our logical decision-making, emotional control. When trauma impacts, it totally throws off that balance. So we're not dealing with our logical brain that we normally deal with, every day of the week and every, our regular interactions at the job and everything else. We're dealing with the I call it the ostercus part of the brain. And by the way, stercus, I took Latin in high school, and stercus is another way of saying another word that begins with S. It's the ostercus part of our brain. And so that's the part of the brain we need to ask the questions to. So if we focus our questions more towards giving up control and letting that person tell their narrative their way, because if we're asking them, tell me the story from point A to point B and give me every single little detail you can remember, it's a good way of doing, like with cognitive interviewing, it's a good brain-based cue. But if somebody's highly traumatized, their logical thinking center was not in control during the traumatic event. And we're asking a question of the logical thinking center.
Right.
So it's just not going to work as well. What they remember more is the experience. I mean, think about any horrible event people have been in. You remember a certain smell that was going on, a certain song that was playing, things like that. So we're asking about that kind of stuff. You can get you're going to get a better shot at getting access to that memory.
Yeah. And I don't think there's any harm, and you could tell me if I'm wrong here, in approaching every fact gathering interview that way, right? It doesn't necessarily mean I have to walk into an interview and say, all right, I have to be trauma informed here, or I don't have to be trauma informed. When you approach a conversation with this rapport, empathy, giving up some control, like controlling the conversation, but giving up the order of the storytelling, right, to the subject, let them experience it, whether they've been exposed to trauma or not, it's going to be easier to remember the event, right? If you let somebody kind of walk you through. We talk a lot about that in the cognitive interview approach. And so people don't have to freak out and think, okay, I need to diagnose, has this person been exposed to trauma or not beforehand? A lot of these can apply in every fact gathering interview, right? To take that precaution. Carrie mentioned, which good call out. There's a book and a Netflix documentary titled Unbelievable. The original title of the book was False Reports.
Story of Rape in America.
You got it. The Story of Rape in America by Kristen Miller, Ken Armstrong. It's a great one to watch or to read about a real case out of kind of the Northwest area of a serial rapist. And you hear a lot of these same things that Brian's talking about, or how detectives originally disbelieve a victim, a complainant, because her story's inconsistent. She doesn't have the appropriate emotions. And they actually charge her with false reporting of a crime. So that's really good example. Thanks for sharing that, Carrie.
I do want to point out that the
Yeah.
police department in that instance, they did a good thing in the fact that they said, yeah, mea culpa, and let's talk about it. And that's where, it's a good thing when people can say, and that's why you mentioned earlier, why did I tell the story about what I did? I find that telling stories about where, I screwed up is a really good way of learning. Here, I can give somebody my learning experience without, them having to go through it. So it's a good idea with that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It was called a False Report, Story of Rape in America.
Yeah, and I think they changed the title to Unbelievable on Netflix.
Yeah,
but that's the book. Yeah, that Brian, that's a good point. Is you had some really good police work too demonstrated in that story, right? I think it was two female detectives that ended up kind of being the lead investigators that found out what happened. At least the way that Unbelievable is told. I don't know the real facts, but then
it was a different state, and they figured it out that it was part of the whole. And they actually found the evidence that proved she was telling the truth in the original case.
Yeah, and I think how you kind of kicked off this session today is it's being self-aware, and all of you that signed up for this, right? You signed up because maybe you were unaware of what trauma informed is, and I think that's a huge step in your professional development, is reflecting back and thinking, oh, maybe when that person didn't remember, what the robbery suspect looked like, they weren't lying to me. Maybe they just were exposed to trauma, and that's why. Or when that employee wouldn't look at me, avoided eye contact, and was real fidgety, maybe it's because they'd been interviewed 6 years ago at a different company, and this was re-triggering them. And so it's not to assume every single one of these incidents is a result of trauma, but being trauma informed means being aware that these things can impact your conversation and your interviewee. I know we're almost out of time, but one thing that I think is really important, and then I'll put up some takeaways. You mentioned this earlier, Brian, but the other person in that interview room that can be exposed to trauma is the interviewer. And I know you've done a lot of really good work and advocacy on, interviewer self-care and keeping track of your own mental health and your partner's mental health. And so, especially in your experience after decades of these types of conversations, any suggestions or resources or advice for how to just kind of self-check if we're doing okay ourselves or our partner?
Yeah, there's a lot of things, and one of the big issues, and one of the things that it's always suggested, is find something not work related, just something that you can turn it off. And sometimes that's hard, especially for law enforcement. Law enforcement is one of those jobs that's not just a job. You wrap yourself in your identity of it, and so finding a way to unplug from that is going to be very, very important, and taking the ego out of things. But something just as a general rule to keep in mind is there's multiple different kinds of post-traumatic stress. One thing we didn't really touch on, but I think it's also really important to talk about, is with trauma informed, it doesn't really matter how somebody got traumatized, because the brain process is going to be the same whether they were in combat, if they were in a car wreck, if they, or had to take care of a sick parent who was dying. Those are all traumatizing incidents, and the brain pattern is the same. It's treated differently, obviously, but the mechanism in the brain is the same. But yeah, just understanding that one of the ways that some people get exposed to trauma is by repeated exposure to other people's trauma, which is why you may find that elementary school teachers in an inner city deal with abused and neglected children are going to have an issue. Believe it or not, the reason that social workers are so big into self-care is because they are highly exposed to traumatic incidents, secondary PTSD. I'm not the one being traumatized. It's not my issue. But, even if somebody's lucky enough as a police officer never to have been shot at, you're talking to people who have been on, multiple times. And so that can be traumatizing in and of itself. And so it goes back to what you said. It's the awareness. In therapy, they call it mindfulness. I'm a big practitioner and a big believer in mindfulness. Understanding where I can say, okay, this is me kind of going too far into this, knowing when, okay, this is too much, I need to step back. And that's really tough, especially for my law enforcement people on here, because we're not supposed to be affected by any of this.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's good. And it's a good note to end on. It's important, obviously, from a tactical standpoint, that we're trauma informed, but also being self-aware, right? And taking care of ourselves and our teammates is important. Stay safe, everyone. Thanks. Have a good day.
All right. Take care.